Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to our Ritual Night Talk for October 5th. I'm Scott Stenwick, your host for these Ritual Night Talk events, presented under the auspices of Leaping Laughter OTO in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you like these videos, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, request notifications. That way you won't miss it when we go live. I've included a couple of articles in the description. One is about the operant equation, which when I get started here won't necessarily sound like it's related, but which I hope to get to by the end of the talk. And the donation link, which helps to support the operations of Leaping Laughter OTO. We take donations over PayPal. No donation is too small and everything is appreciated. So tonight I am going to be talking about what I call mythic magic. Okay. That's like this really big sounding word, right? It's mythic. Okay. And what I'm talking about by that is the kind of magic that we see, the histories of religion, the histories of mythology, even like some of the stories from the Middle Ages of magicians who could do, just amazing stuff, right? We sit down and we work with our magic and all that. And, every so often we get some, just truly amazing thing happen. But, most of the time, the probabilities, which is I'm looking at with the operant equation, which is derived from Peter Carroll's chaos magic equations and so on, as you'll see when you get into the article. Those tend to be the kinds of probabilities that we more commonly see. You don't see a magician walking down the street and, like throwing a fireball at somebody or a lightning bolt or something like that. That's generally not something that you see. And it's generally not something that, at least it's something that I have never been able to do. Okay. And the reason for that is largely the probability gradients and so on that we can look at. And there's reasons to look at that and say, well, magic seems to be maybe about this powerful and not about that powerful. But with the stories we've got from the past, there's all kinds of stuff that magicians have done. And some of those stories come, right out of, the main mythology of the Western tradition, which is Christianity. Okay. And so Christians hate it when you talk about, or at least literalist Christians do. I'm not going to say all Christians because I don't want to get into that. There are some Christians who are fine with this, but fundamentalist Christians, and we had a fundamentalist on the live chat last week, like posting Bible quotes about how magic was bad, and then they left, I guess, because we were ignoring them. But the thing is that mythology in our culture has this context of being fake. Okay, so you come up in, elementary school and you maybe learn about Greek mythology, but like nobody really tells you, well, yeah, and these Greek gods, they're real and this and this and this. Whereas, coming up in church, you'll say, okay, well, so here are these stories of, here from the Old Testament, from the New Testament, and this stuff, yeah, this is true, and this is our religion. And so that's, I think, where the contrast kind of comes from. But mythology is really simply about, the kinds of stories that support a particular worldview, pantheon, religion. There are a lot of different connotations to mythology, and mythology is not necessarily untrue or completely untrue. Okay, I get into arguments years back about the historical roots of Jesus. Okay, and there are some scholars out there who think nobody like Jesus ever existed, and that Jesus was a story that some people made up, and that Jesus is basically a myth, with the myth being connoted as fake. Okay. Now, I will say that if you ask me, did a historical Jesus exist? I would have to say no if you mean, did a person exist who did all of the things that are recorded in the Gospels? Because we're pretty sure that's not true. You could be looking at, somebody existed at that time who did some of the things in the Gospels. And more to the point, it could have been more than one person whose stories were combined together. Because at that time in Palestine, there were all kinds of these little like, messianic sects and groups that were like working against the Roman Empire. Actually, that's one of the things that Monty Python's The Life of Brian actually gets correct. It's like there's all these little like splinter groups running around like trying to overthrow the Romans and stuff like that. And I mean, they do it in a comedic way, but that really was what it was like. And there were preachers, there were people who believed that, the Messiah was really coming. And, there were people who claimed that, they were spiritual leaders. And there's a whole bunch of them. We do know that there are enough historical records to show that, for example, John the Baptist, who appears in the Gospels, was a real person. And I mean, some people even believe that, well, he was actually the founder of Christianity, and then they came up with this Jesus afterwards when he was arrested. Don't necessarily know. But let me point this out about Greek mythology, too. For the longest time, people thought the mythological stories about the Trojan War were not real history, and they were stories that Homer had written down or whatnot. But there is actually evidence that there was a Trojan War, and we can find some archaeological and historical evidence that some of that happened. That doesn't mean it's exactly like what's in the mythology, because we probably don't really know, because in many cases these stories will change over time. And for example, in the stories of the Old Testament, the Bible wasn't actually written down until about a little after 600 BC, I think 580 something, after the Babylonian captivity, when the Jewish people had been enslaved by the Babylonians, and they gained their freedom, and they came back to Israel, and they sat down and said, okay, well, we're going to write down, what our religion believes. And so what you were talking about is you're talking about, a group of people, and we can show textual analysis. There are at least 4 authors of the Pentateuch, who very likely could have even been some like a committee who sat down and said, all right, let's bring these stories together and like put it into a narrative. And so you've got a lot of stuff in there that's like really magical. It sounds really mythic and stuff like that. But most of these stories supposedly happened, 1300 BC, 1400 BC, going way back in time. And because, you're writing something down that's gone back, that's from way long ago. And also you're writing it down after your whole culture has gone through this period where you have an enemy that was trying to basically wipe out their culture, basically like teach the Israelites to be Babylonian. That there's inevitably going to be some overlap there, some things that, are forgotten, some things that don't quite work, some things where, okay, well, the story's like this, but it then gets mixed with other things and so on. There is an example in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which has a story of a flood that's very similar to the story of the flood of Noah. It's not like, well, the flood doesn't like necessarily cover the entire world or whatnot, but many of the events are very similar. It's this big flood. They go on a ship, they take animals, they're out at sea for a long time. They finally set a bird to find land. A lot of the stuff in the Epic of Gilgamesh is very similar. And that probably was inspired by the Babylonian story. Another example, which I wrote about on my blog years ago, is this idea of the parting of the Red Sea when the Israelites escaped from Egypt in the book of Exodus. So Moses supposedly, raised his staff and the ocean parted and the Israelites could walk across. And of course, it's been done to death in, like the 10 Commandments movies and stuff like that. And, people are impressed with there's the glass wall trick that they did at the studio. Everybody's like so impressed with that when that first came out in the film. But the reality is that it is very possible that what is talked about in that story was not actually parting the Red Sea as we know it, but the water of an area called the Sea of Reeds. Okay. And in fact, the Sea of Reeds is an area where the sea does part on occasion. There's been research on it. If the wind gets above a certain level, the water will actually be pushed back and you can walk across. It's rare. The winds have to be 60 some miles an hour. I actually have an article on my blog. I probably should have linked that because I talked about that a while ago. But maybe I'll link it in the comments after this. But yeah, so if you get a wind there that is like between 60 and 70 miles an hour, the water will actually part. So in order to if you're a magician and you're walking up to the Sea of Reeds and you want to make that happen, what you got to do is you got to conjure a wind that's powerful enough, and then the sea will part and you can walk across. Now, if you can conjure a wind that powerful, well, you just did one of the miracles that Moses did. Congratulations. Okay, so here's how some of this stuff, makes it into the oral tradition, and it is possible that something like that could have happened, or it could be based on people knew about this phenomena where the sea would part sometimes, or something like that, and they worked it into the story. And I mean, the story of the Israelites fleeing Egypt are really similar to they're really similar to the idea that they're similar to the story of how the Israelites got out of Babylonia. So it's like, so here we're slaves in Babylon, and we managed to win our freedom, and we make it back to the Holy Land. And so, of course, elements of that story, which had just happened, kind of get mixed in with the story of of the escape from Egypt and Exodus. But that thing about the Sea of Reeds is like, I can do some weather magic. I can conjure wind. I'm not sure if I could conjure wind that high, that powerful in that part of the world, but I've never tried. And I wouldn't completely rule out my ability to do it, depending on the conditions and a bunch of other stuff. It's also mentioned in the story that they were delivered by the mighty east wind. And in that sense, it's like, okay, so they had some idea in the story that it had to do with the wind pushing the sea back. So that's why I'm thinking that perhaps that was the root of that particular story. Some of the stories surrounding Jesus and so forth. Again, some of them are syncretized from other stories, like the myths of Mithraism. Mithraism was very popular at the time, and so like syncretizing Christianity with some elements of Mithraism that appealed to people. And one of the things that I'm going to move on from the history to this idea of mythic magic, and alluding a little bit back to our fundy troll, last week, is that Christians, or at least a lot of Christians, the kind of Christians who go around talking about how magic is evil and stuff like that, don't actually have a problem with magic. They have a problem with people other than them doing it. Okay, so it's, you say, oh, I will pray for this or that. I've talked about this before. Prayer and magic are basically the same thing. You're mobilizing your will in conjunction with some kind of a divine force to make a particular thing happen. And if you are praying for a thing, and that's the key distinction, if there's an intent, you're doing magic. But it doesn't get the kind of, condemnation, people, doing that type of thing in a more efficient way using ceremonial forms, and specifically people doing it who aren't Christian. That's what they get up in arms about. Because if you look in stuff like Acts of the Apostles, again, you have all these different accounts of, the kinds of magical things that the apostles were able to do. They talked about the idea of speaking in tongues. That's gotten kind of corrupted by modern evangelicals, where you're going to speak in tongues. That means you're doing glossalia. Glossalia is a technique, might be related to things like the barbarous names of evocation and some other stuff in esotericism. But if you read Acts of the Apostles, it's pretty clearly not what was being talked about there. The gift of tongues that the apostles supposedly had was they could go into other lands and they could speak, and even if people didn't speak their language, they could understand what they were hearing. And so, as if it were in their own language. And so that was part of how they spread Christianity. Again, don't know if that's a true thing. I do think it's an interesting allusion to the Tower of Babel myth in the Old Testament. Christianity does a lot of stuff calling back to the Old Testament. And so you have the languages all, scattered out during the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis. And then the apostles get the gift of tongues, which is like, well, they can now speak to everybody. So it's kind of like, I suppose, rectifying that in a way. And that might even have been, one of the reasons it was written the way it was. But the thing about it is that, we have this idea that, that magic back then, probably, we're looking at stuff that was exaggerated, and that's probably true. Some of the stories definitely are things that even being a magician, I have a hard time looking at and trying to figure out exactly how it was done, how it could have been done with a probability shift of this or that, or, and so forth. And so, but what I wanted to get to here, that being said, I wanted to talk a little bit about some ideas that I've had in terms of trying to see what you could do to push the probability of magic into the mythic type realm. In other words, how close could we get to some of these, mythic stories about, spiritual leaders, spiritual power, these people who I basically think are, all magicians working with, various different divine forces. And how close can we get in the modern age to doing magic like that? And this has been a thing that people in the magical community have been interested in for a long time. Same with people who are interested in psychic powers. They kind of want to do the same thing for psychic powers. And psychic powers basically are the same thing as magic. But what we're doing with magic is it's like, psychic power is like a raw ability. And with magic, what we're doing is we're shaping it and we're trying to use it in a more efficient way than just like kind of willing stuff to happen, which while it can work, tends to be less efficient in terms of probability. So first of all, you want to look at optimizing the variables that go into a magical operation. And I have my take on those variables in that operant equation article that I have linked. And I originally got the idea of doing something like that based on Peter Carroll's Liber Chaos. Chaos magic, it has had a bigger influence on the way I do magic than you might think it does at first glance. I'm a Thelemite and I use pentagram rituals. I use hexagram rituals. I use a lot of the things that were considered traditional magic before the chaos magic movement, from the late 70s, through the 90s. And I mean, up until today, I mean, there are still people who practice chaos magic. That was when kind of chaos magic kind of came on the scene, like in the 80s, and then into the 90s, it got super popular. You had like the Alt Magic Chaos News Group, that all kinds of innovative stuff people were discussing on there, and so forth. So Carroll had this idea of, could you build an equation that looked at, the probability that a magical effect would produce based on various factors? And, I'm not going to lay out Carroll's entire system. I talk about it in the article, like comparing and contrasting how my version is different than his. There's a couple of key differences that I want to highlight. One of those differences is I definitely work with external spirits, and that's not necessarily mentioned in the equation article because the equation is more looking at just from the standpoint of the individual magician. But I definitely work with spirits that I treat as external, and I have really no reason to think that they aren't. But at the same time, I also accept that, my magical power has a role in doing things too. The reason you get a spirit is because you and the spirit together can do more than you can do by yourself. There are some people who put out that, oh, magic is just about calling the spirits do all the magic. Well, that's obviously not true. If you look at psychic powers, psychic abilities, and so on, where people aren't calling spirits. But counterpoint to that, I will point out that in one of the articles that I talked about based on the documentary Crazy Rulers of the World, which is the documentary that inspired the film The Men Who Stare at Goats, John Ronson put together, talked to one of the people in this program who supposedly had actually like knocked out a goat with his mind. And he explained how he did it. And it literally sounds like him doing magic. He just doesn't know forms. So he's like, okay, so he visualizes himself like being at one with God, and up in heaven where God is. Okay, so there's your preliminary invocation. Then he's visualizing the Archangel Michael, in that picture, like where he's driving Satan down. He's visualizing the Archangel Michael going down and like knocking down this goat. Okay, so he did a preliminary invocation. He conjured an archangel and delivered a charge. Okay, we do that more efficiently in ours. He was just doing this all visualization because he came from the psychic world and just had kind of figured out that this worked. But it's like, okay, so that's what we do, but like more regimented and more formally. And so there's a lot of interplay back and forth there. I would say, so his power and the power of the Archangel Michael were being brought to bear to knock out that goat. And, whether or not, knocking out a goat is something that, you particularly need to do in like a military situation. And also, I don't know if they tried to deliberately make the experiment easy by, say, using fainting goats, which can like fall over randomly. That's a possibility with that experiment too. I'm not sure. It's not documented, but would explain why they were using goats though, because fainting goats are mostly goats. It doesn't seem to occur in other kinds of livestock. But anyway, the point being that by looking at those variables, you can optimize what happens in your magical operation. Like a couple of the another difference that I have is I don't buy into this idea of rituals are powerful when you forget about them. That's not experimentally true. If that was experimentally true, I have an eidetic memory. It's very hard for me to make myself forget what I just did. And I would never be able to do magic if it was necessary to completely forget the operation. One of the other slight differences, this is actually a slight one, is that I am not of the opinion that belief powers magic. I don't think belief is the power behind magic. I think that comes out of kind of Protestant Christianity, the idea of, justification by faith and so forth. And I think that's where the idea is inspired by. And, if you're trying to come up with, something that powers magic that is not, necessarily related to any external spirit or force or whatnot, a belief, I suppose, is as good as anything. But it's slightly wrong in my experience. So one of the keys to doing magic is if you doubt what you're doing, your mind is going to be divided against itself and you're going to have trouble maintaining single-pointed focus. Okay. And I guess as a Thelemite, well, I'm not going to say it's belief. I'm going to say it's will. And of course, I would say that because I'm a Thelemite and, and we believe that will does this. So there's a belief component there. I guess tease it out however you want. But the point is that how this works, it works more like doubt or division is a form of resistance. And instead of belief powering your magic, doubt, which is the opposite of belief, impedes your magic. And it's a small difference. But I think it's important to understand because some of the assumptions that leads to, the belief powers magic idea, gives you things like, trying to do, well, you should be able to do the most powerful magic ever with like pop culture characters because all these children watch cartoons with them and believe in them. Well, it's not just the belief. And those experiments that people did on alt magic chaos back in the day, generally they reported that they didn't work well if they reported them at all. And I'm going to point out too, I don't know that, Peter Carroll or Phil Hine or any of the early chaos magicians would be like, oh yeah, that's totally what you should do. You should conjure, a cartoon. But that was one of the things that was getting thrown around a lot on those discussion boards. And there were people who had the idea that because belief powered magic, it should work. And they were kind of confused as to why it didn't work better than it did. But belief is not this quantity. It's like that you can keep getting more and more and more of. It's more like, here's your focus. And the more resistance you have, your ability is going to drop off. But when you get to zero resistance, you're just at zero resistance. You can't like make -1 resistance or something like that. And it doesn't behave that way. The other thing about the forgetting operations is there is a degree to which that is true. And I think perhaps that was a case of Carroll doing the kind of put the fence around the thing to try and make sure people didn't make what the real mistake was. The real mistake is if you send out an operation and you constantly think about it and obsess about it and direct attention toward it, it seems like those operations almost always fail. So the forgetting thing, I think, has more to do with, well, just try to forget about it. In other words, if you find yourself starting worrying about whether it works or not, redirect your mind and think about something else, because that is a valid practical technique and that does matter. Okay. And you do want to, it's like, if you ever seen somebody who they do a tarot reading and then, they don't like the results. They do another tarot reading and they do another tarot reading until they finally get, one that they like. But it's pointless because it's like the first reading generally tells what actually is going to happen. And sure, you can keep shuffling the cards and like dealing spreads, but that's not really that, it doesn't really give you any insight. You're basically forcing the cards to do, what you want to, that, you're just getting what you want to hear. Let's see. So simple magic tests that you could do from home in the questions. So I find the lottery numbers are really helpful because they're raw probability. But okay, if you were trying to do something other than lottery numbers, you could just come up with something that you roughly know how unlikely it is to happen. Okay, and there's a lot of things where you can see this. There's things like like odds and like sports betting, stuff like that. There's a lot of things where probability is calculated pretty exactly. Or you could try to make something happen that you really think is unlikely and really hasn't happened to you before, and then do the spell and then try to go and not change your behavior too much and see what actually happens. Here's what I will say. Doing a test just to do a test is probably not the best thing to do. And the reason is that, you're doing this not because it's something that you really want. It's because, well, I just want to test this and see if it works. Okay. And it's fine to have a scientific attitude about it. But for example, like I talk about when I play the lottery. Okay. When I'm using the lottery test, I always go and buy a ticket. I don't like just say I'm going to influence these numbers and then see what comes up. And the reason is that, so I bought a ticket, I could actually win. And I am of the opinion that if I was not in that situation, number one, I don't know how well it would work, because really, whether I get the numbers or not, it doesn't benefit me at all. And, to some extent, you've got, the entire coherence of your psyche, and so what I'm really doing is I'm doing something kind of pointless, because, I'm going to make these numbers come up and then see if the numbers come up. Well, but I didn't actually play any of those numbers, so I can't possibly win. Okay. I go out, I buy the ticket, I spend the $1, I spend the $2, I get one ticket, and then I test the numbers that are on the ticket. So that's how I do those tests. And for something like the Powerball, the probability gradient is so huge that you're not going to win the jackpot. But the fact that the jackpot is out there is this kind of inspiring, aspirational thing. And there really is something to that gnosis that Peter Carroll talks about. In chaos magic, gnosis is sometimes treated as a little more general shifting consciousness, or a general kind of trance. But gnosis, real gnosis, also has this kind of awe and inspiring component to it too. It's not just shifting your consciousness, it's shifting your consciousness in certain ways. And it's a particular state of consciousness. In Christianity, in the Bible, it was called metanoia, meta-awareness. In the Eastern systems, they talk about it as stages of enlightenment, and in the Hindu system, they talk about it as samadhi, and so forth. These ideas that it's this kind of expansion and absorption in, something bigger and greater than yourself. And that is what gnosis really is. And incidentally, I'm going to repeat this. It's in the Bible because people always get it wrong because of mistranslation. So Jesus says to people, repent and follow me. Okay. Repentance implies, I got to feel bad about like all this stuff I previously did wrong. Okay. That's not what metanoia is at all. Metanoia is exactly how it sounds. Okay. So, paranoia is like alternate awareness, like delusions and so forth. Metanoia is expanded or meta level awareness. It doesn't have anything to do with feeling guilty. And the reason it's that way in English is because metanoia was translated into penitentia in Latin, which has the same connotation as the English repentance. And then repentance was translated from penitentia into English correctly, but into the Latin, it wasn't translated quite correctly. So that's where that comes from. And so Jesus was saying, get enlightened and follow me. He wasn't saying, feel bad and follow me. It's like the old, celebrate your beliefs, don't mourn them, as Kevin Smith put it. But anyway, so that's the thing about it, that there's this thing out here that really is this thing that you could theoretically get if your power was just, incredible. I think, my opinion, I think that spurs your magical power to work a little bit better. I think it pushes you. It gives you that emotional connection that's going to help you get that will, really single pointed. Because, boy, who doesn't want that jackpot? And so that helps you focus. The intention and wanting the intention is something you can work into your magic. It is similar to, but not identical to, I don't want to mischaracterize, but there's a general idea in Vajrayana Buddhism that talks about the idea of transforming desire energy into enlightenment. And I think desire energy is a part of will. Clearly, it's brought in with will. You have desire energy, you have focus, you have thinking components, you have feeling components. It's the totality of your consciousness brought to a single point to accomplish a particular thing. And that single point is going to take some of that is going to be that desire energy that goes into the ultimate magical probability shift. So if you're casting for something that you really want, that's good. The only problem is you want to make sure you cast for something you really want, but then don't obsess about it. Because if you obsess about, is it going to work or is it not going to work? That's when you get into the problem of, like Carol was talking about, where it's like, well, you're thinking about the operation too much. And I think in a quantum information model standpoint, you've got a thought form, it's out in the universe. When you connect to it, theoretically, it can do like an entanglement collapse kind of thing. And it may then that's going to affect the final probability shift. Whereas if you cast it and you don't think about it enough that it's basically left alone, it's going to go out and do stuff. And it's going to work successfully without interference and impediment. So, and some of that stuff too is mediated by the operant field. Some of that's mediated by closing with a banishing pentagram ritual. So you're detaching to at least to what extent you can from the thing you sent out. You can use containment structures and talismans. Those aren't necessarily linked to you, and so on. There's a bunch of tricks. But the tricks are only going to get you so far. Now, so let's say that you figured this out. You've got your probability shift calculated. This is about what you can do. And all right, so you're pretty good. Okay, you test it experimentally. You find out kind of what your magical strength is, like how powerfully you cast. That's going to get higher as you get better. Although it does get to a point where it starts to level off. It's like, physical world starts to push back more and more, and you have to work harder to get bigger shifts. And I'm not sure what the exact relationship is. That does seem to be how it works. And so the thing about that then is, all right, so how do you get mythic magic? Mythic magic is, we're talking about stuff that's beyond these probability levels that we can normally throw around in our daily lives. So what are some tricks that we can do to increase the power that we have? So one of the ways you can do that, I talked about it in the article on the operant equation at the end, is you can work with a group of people. Okay, so if you work with a magical group, each person has their own level of magical strength. And when you do a spell together, you can go ahead and you can add those strengths together. And this works great if you have a really coherent group. But if you have an incoherent group, as you look in the equation, as I talk about, what can happen is the degree of gnosis factor in there can kind of drop off, like a little bit. Like if you're doing a ritual, but like you've got some people who aren't as familiar what you're doing, and you may need to break your concentration a little bit to coach them to do something, or their mind may wander a little more than yours because they're not familiar with the forms. All these kinds of things are things that can happen. And they're okay. As a group works together, they're going to get better at syncing up. And once the group really syncs up, then you can add together the strength of the assembled magicians. Now, so that's okay. I can get a group of people together. Let's say I can get, 5 people together, and I can do, 5 times what I could normally do on a probability shift. Okay. I've heard some people put forth the idea that when multiple people work together, it's like their relative strengths multiply. And I have seen no evidence that that's the case. The function appears to be additive. Groups all the way up to, 10 people, 12 people, 15 people. And once you get past that, you wind up getting groups that are more diffuse. And, it's hard to have everybody focused on the same magical operation. Or at least, if you have people with that number of people, you're usually going to have some people who are kind of unfamiliar with what you're doing. So you can tamp that out, though, by working together, doing multiple operations together, just remembering that, the operations that you're doing probably early on, they're not going to be as good, but the potential is a lot higher with more people if you're willing to work with it. Okay. The other thing that chaos magic doesn't really mention, and I don't talk about in the formula there, but spirits can pretty much be treated just like additional people. Okay. So if I'm going ahead and let's say that I want to cast a Mercury spell for healing, and I go ahead and I conjure Raphael, and I conjure Tyrael, and I conjure Taphthartharos. So I've got the angel, the intelligence, and the spirit, and then I have my. Okay, well, so now I've basically got 4 entities effectively directing power toward what what we want to do. They do have to be coherent entities. I had a question in the blog earlier about, well, what if I called this spirit and this spirit and this spirit and this spirit? And it's like, well, so sometimes you can get spirits to combine like that. But if you're going outside of an established hierarchy, or like calling in multiple hierarchies at the same time, I find that tends to muddle things, and you could sometimes get like a really big success, but a lot of the time it doesn't work. So it's pretty unreliable. I find that more spirits on the same hierarchy does seem to help. So I had gone and updated my planetary magic spells at one point. All right, so we're calling the angel. We're just putting the angel sigil on here, and we're just going to call the angel, and because that seems like it's basically been working for me. And then I went through and like, okay, but you know what? I got a probability test. So I went through and probability tested them again with calling the angel versus calling the angel, the intelligence, and the spirit. And angel, intelligence, and spirit was better every time. Even though I just had the angel sigil in there, it seems like the sigil, remember, that's kind of like the phone number of who you're talking to. Once you get the angel there, the angel can easily get you in touch with the intelligence and the spirit. But you got to call in the intelligence and the spirit. It really did seem to make a difference. It's like, so, all right, so my probabilities just go up when I go back to calling the intelligence and spirit in addition to the angel. I can get a good result with the angel. I get a better result conjuring all 3. So multiple spirits, as long as they're harmonious and coherent spirits, can accomplish bigger magical effects. In the Enochian system, very commonly, if you look at my Enochian books, you'll have multiple spirits called in at the same time. So in the Heptarchia Mystica, if you call the king, you get the prince and the ministers. If you call the prince, you get the prince and the ministers. If you work with the great table, like, for example, the kings, you would call all 4 kings. If you're going to call the seniors, you would call all 24 seniors, and so forth. And these are all called in a group in your Sigillum de Amath, then you deliver the charge to all of them. And so that's one way in which Enochian has some pretty big probability shifts associated with it. You're calling in more spirits, and they themselves are part of like a grid of other additional spirits and so on. And by calling in that many spirits and then directing that charge out, you got more entities on the case. So it's you and all the spirits you called in. If it's a group of people doing Enochian work, maybe you've got your 6 people here, and then you're going to call in the 24 seniors. So you got 30 entities working on what you can do. And I mean, those entities have, varying levels of probability shift that they seem to be able to bring to operations. So that's a cool one. The last idea I want to touch on is the idea of building talismans. And I've mentioned this in a couple of other talks. A talisman, what's special about it is it's a freestanding object that creates a permanent magical effect. So this object is not attached to you. You deliberately disconnect yourself from it. And you program the talisman to, pull in energy a certain way to keep itself alive. You can program it to do all sorts of stuff. One of the other areas where chaos magic influences my work a lot is if you look at some of the work chaos magic did on servitors, which was really groundbreaking stuff, you could do the same thing with objects. And in fact, some chaos magicians did. They would have an object and they just bind a servitor into an object. That's basically what I'm talking about when I'm creating a talisman. It's pretty much the same technique. I'm just calling in spirits in addition to myself to help me empower the thing the way I want it to be empowered. Now, if you just have one talisman doing something, it seems like the talisman requires some amount of energy to sustain itself. So the probability shift that a talisman will do is not quite the probability shift that you could do if you were just casting a straight operation. It's about 80% of that. But it's 80% of the total effect of the operation that you get. And so For example, talismans, like I talked about last week with astrological magic, they can lock in particular astrological conditions. So if you make a talisman under an astrological condition that is really, really auspicious, like instead of doing a healing spell, I'm going to do a healing talisman with Mercury, and I'm going to call Raphael, Tyrael, and Tefthar-Thorath. But I'm going to call them when Mercury is making just this fantastic aspect in the sky. That aspect in the sky is going to help going into the talisman. Now, you get that aspect if you cast a spell at that time, too. The difference with the talisman is the talisman is an ongoing effect, and it will carry that energy with it. And if you understand why that's important, you understand, wow, why you really should work with astrology, and why, if you're going to make a talisman at all, you shouldn't be making one when the aspect is bad, because what's going to happen is it's not going to work. It's going to lock in the negative condition as part of its creation. But, okay, so there's that 80% reduction. It can lock in astrological stuff. But here's the big one. You can make as many talismans as you want. And I don't mean in one ritual. I don't mean pile, 100 pieces of metal in here for like a sun talisman for wealth, and say like, all right, I've got like all these little engraved pieces of brass. There's like 100 of them. Conjure all 100 of these to do this. Okay. What happens when you do that is the talismans, they get created. It creates it almost like a web or a field. And that's useful for some things. The probability shift you get with that pile of talismans is the same as you would get with one talisman. So you can't really hack it that way. You can hack it, though, by doing separate individual rituals with talismans for the same purpose. And those probability shifts can combine. And so, I mean, if you had the time to sit down and make talismans every day for various things, what's going to happen is, okay, well, this one's 80% of what you got. Well, now you've got 2. That's, 80% times 2. That's 1.6 times. You've got 3, it's 2.4 times, and so on. And it's going to add up. So, you can make a bunch of things. And, what that will do is that'll allow you to increase the probability shift that you can accomplish. I don't know to what extent that gets into the mythic realm. I've experimented with small numbers of talismans for this. It seems to work. There might be a point where past a certain number, you get a point of diminishing returns. I don't have that information. I've never talked to a magician who's done those experiments, or at least who has done those experiments and has been willing to tell me. So I'm not 100% sure. But it seems like certainly for, small numbers of talismans, to get an effect that's bigger than what you could normally cast, get more of them. And, you do need to create them in individual separate rituals. Like I said, it's the instance theory idea. So you're conjuring an instance of the spirit, and then that instance is creating the talisman. If it's an instance and that's creating 100 talismans, so the power is divided between the 100 talismans, and they all basically work kind of together as one talisman. But every new instance that you conjure, that's a new operation. And that again goes back to this individual talisman does, 0.8, whatever the effect would be. This one also does 0.8. This one also does 0.8. And they don't seem to interfere with each other, especially if you're calling on the same spirits to create them. And if you want to be careful, you can build that into your charge. Accomplish this, without interfering with any other, and you can make those charges as complex as you want. And so that's another way of hacking things in the direction of maybe magic that you could get toward a mythic kind of level. The one other idea I want to talk about, I'm not going to go into detail. I've done very few of these experiments, but working with some of the ideas like orgone radionics. Radionics is a way of using stuff like radio waves to carry, magical energy, whatever that is. That's at least according to the Casamano model, which is that, so psychic energy is something, it can be carried by an electromagnetic wave. It can be amplified by an electromagnetic wave. It's not an electromagnetic wave, which I think fits pretty well with my quantum information idea. And so you could look at trying to amplify magic using, like radio components like that. And there are magicians who work with this, and they report good success with it. I have a little chi generator over here that I use to power talismans. It's an orgone radionics thing that I ordered. I didn't build it. Basically, I ordered it to see if it worked, and it seemed like, wow, it seems like it's been working pretty well. And so I have that in a little orgone accumulator box, and then I'll take my talisman. And rather than wear a talisman around, I'll link it to myself. They'll get a drop of blood on the talisman. Then you put it over in the orgone accumulator box, then the machine just feeds it, 24/7. I just keep the thing on. So that has seemed to be helpful to me over the years. And I'm not at a point where I've experimented enough with it to really have a coherent model or framework as to why or how that would work or what the probability shifts do. But the work is ongoing. And believe me, when I have it, I will share it because that's what I do. I don't see the point of keeping this stuff secret. I think the material needs to be made available to people. We need to have peer review. We need to have openness. We need to have transparency. This whole secrecy of magical techniques and stuff like that, really, to my way of thinking, doesn't help anyone. So with that, I'm going to sign off for tonight. Thank you very much for watching tonight. I'll go ahead and see if I can find that Red Sea article or the Sea of Reeds article and add that as a comment to the video because it's pretty interesting. It's like, hey, the Sea of Reeds, okay, it's not the Red Sea, it's like further north and it's shallower water, but when it gets past the point, it can part and you can walk across. And if you were walking across it and you were walking across that and you had chariots chasing you, all the water would come back in. It probably wouldn't drown the army because the water's not that deep, but boy, those chariots would get stuck. They would not be able to proceed. So with that, have a great rest of the evening and thanks for watching. Love is the law, love under will.